Hello all, and jumping right in where I left off on my last video about Hegel, I guess we could start with perhaps considering that the Hegelian dialectic, or his logic, if it were, is really a sort of concept in the kind of Hegelian style as opposed to thinking in a kind of logical, propositional, linear inference, if you will, with like Kant, for example, where Kant, is attributed many times with, kind of having this sort of architecture, if you will, with how his arguments are laid out in his critiques. It's step by step, deductive proposition after proposition, following in a linear way, and that's really how most of the classics, going back through the Greeks and through modernity, that's how most of thought had been done. As of course Kant points out that substance is kind of our idea, and so the appearances out of the substance is really kind of the stepping stone, I would say, to get towards what Hegel's trying to go about. He's trying to make a concept instead. And so I think when you consider that, that's really my advice, if you will, on how to start with Hegel. He's trying to unpack concepts and thinking through on something. And of course, the biggest concept, or the grand synthesis, if you will, of the system is being and non-being. And for Hegel, there's existence necessarily has this sort of essence to it in relationship to its environment, as opposed to just a sort of bare proposition of existence itself, which of course is going to get flipped eventually in postmodernity. It kind of is a little bit weird to talk in this sort of fashion, but of course this is with history considered here. But if we're going to perhaps look at Hegelian logic, and really bear out the sort of what he means by things like negation. It's the notion, as he points out, to say blue, and the antithesis of that would be not blue, which doesn't affirm the former, but it also doesn't describe like yellow. It's that sort of negation, but it doesn't really give you an understanding of polarity, though, because ultimately what is going to be what's not, and you have to account for what would be the most concrete form of being for Hegel, which is becoming. And the process of in the dialectical approach here, of those polarities, being and non-being, universal, particular, reason, reality, appearance, or the real. He's trying to draw out the concept of those polarities, or account for them in a way that you can't just do from inference in that sort of static way of looking at things that was repercussive, if you will, of the atom, and that sort of substance metaphysic, which, as I pointed out in my videos previewing Hegel, this goes back to the grand discussion of change, and in that sort of Greek ethos of becoming and not crossing the river twice. And when you look at the Phenomenology of Mind, in the early chapters, of course, he's trying to establish how truthful statements, with time accounted for it, aren't always going to be true forever. Like such as when he was pointing out about, if you read about the light during the day at night, then it doesn't really make sense, even though it was true. So things like contradiction and is really just, it's not satisfactory for Hegel, as it were. And I want to brush up on the attention for what Hegel's trying to account for in the unchanging. What are the forms, and that's why he's not into empiricism. It's because he understands that that's just the realm of change, but what's actually the unchanging, or the reason, if it were. And that's really getting into his stepping up in his works towards subjective spirit, and that sort of freedom, which is, of course, is very important to German thought, getting towards freedom and reason away from just sensory output. But his phenomenology, though, is looking at these structures of what it consciously is to being in the world, because what else is there other than being in the world and its relationship to it. When Descartes was trying to examine whether or not he existed, he locked himself in a room in a stove, essentially, and that's not Hegel here. Hegel is interested in the relationships of the being, and that sort of essence around him. But you can look at it sort of in a sort of scientific history, and point to the atom, and then point to the rise of chemistry and biology and evolution to come, and its processes. But another way to look at it, of course, is how self-sufficiency was able to really guide towards that sort of structure of being these sort of imperial warriors who cross the globe. One could point out that how else were you going to be able to do that other than having a sort of philosophical system, if you will, of being a man on his own in his own island, providing for himself. That sort of minoritarian strategy, which is something that's very dear to this channel, if you will, is something to consider. How that conscious structure, if you will, if we want to get Gebser about it, of during the early onset of the Enlightenment and going across the globe in that imperial fashion, it requires that sort of minoritarian strategy of being able to be more self-sufficient, as opposed to Hegel and the rise of the nation state here, where we're far more in this sort of dependence as society complexifies. I think it's interesting to perhaps point that out as well, the technological aspect of it, as well as the geopolitics, if you will. But I digress here. We're getting too far off base. I wanted to now talk about sense conscious, which is for Hegel, dealing with that sort of sensory output and its move away towards reason or self-conscious and the objective spirit. Sense conscious, when it's apprehended, is the self-conscious dealing with the world, being in the world, and achieving the higher freedom. That's why he goes after the unhappy Stoics and the skeptics, and points to his philosophy as the alternative here, because you have to apprehend sense consciousness through the self consciousness of the other, instead of just perhaps doubting or locking yourself off in a furnace. It's the creative processes of the self-conscious, the sort of romanticism that Hegel's famous for, and steam powers the century with these romantic notions of these sort of things. But objective spirit, if we were going to flesh it out, is law and order at work. It's the order and structure, and this really gets into Hegel's kind of social theory and why it's attributed to intellectual fascism and Italian fascism, and Giovanni Gentile and others who are Hegelians. It's because objective spirit and law and order of the reason, it comes from the sense conscience, and that universal duty, history. It wasn't just some atomized thing that you comprise in that sort of Kantian way of self-appearance, the self in its own substance, in its creative process. That's not so with Hegel. We're dealing with standing on the giants of history on their shoulders. They've left these sort of consciousness with us, and that really kind of is his deviation from the sort of moral sense philosophy as well, if you can kind of see that. But perhaps another way of looking at it is he's making a sort of synthesis of the social order, individuals in their relationships to others. That's the high achievement. You don't just have freedom, in that sort of man in a vacuum, his own island, doing his own thing. That sort of anarchism, if you will. No, it's the freedom within the relationships and the dependence out of that for the other. And this is kind of my pivot, if you will, to the master and the servant, which is, of course, his famous piece on this sort of othering, where the master has a dependence on the servant, clearly, because otherwise he wouldn't be in charge without the servant. But the servant achieves a sort of independence, if you will, and his own identity in service to the master. Perhaps this resonates more to the audience today, but you have the master and the apprentice, if you will, and eventually in that sort of synthesis, the roles sort of reverse, if you will, or the synthesis ends with a sort of egalitarian sort of equality, where there's a sort of polarity, if you will, that doesn't just stay the same, and there's a dependence there between the master and the apprentice, or in this case, the master and the servant. They both need each other in their sort of social institutions. And this is, of course, why Hegel points to social values such as family and the nation state. We're not just individuals, but the essence of these relationships around us. And it's interesting to look at alongside just philosophy of history, of course, and the sciences, but also that sort of technology and modern aspect of becoming a nation state at this point in history, and it's how it complexifies out. And I guess there is some words to point out before we move on to other topics on Hegel, and that's alienation, of course, comes out of the master and the servant dialectic. This is highly influential for people who are into Marxism. So there is a lot of different ways that Hegelian thought fleshes out from here. And there's a reason why, and I've said this a million times, of course, on the channel, that if you look at what Hegel's doing with philosophy and the way he thinks of philosophy as a whole, philosophy is the most concrete. It's the concept, thought of being, and of course its importance of culture as a whole for the human, for the being. That's really how I wanted to perhaps end it, and look at those kind of influences of seeing his philosophical approach here through philosophy toward human existence being within these sort of institutions and relationships to its environment, and it's his logic towards the subject and the object doesn't just have a sort of static representation off alone here, but there's a polarity to it, to summarize, which is of course important for metaphysics and art and the sciences to come. And yeah, this was just a quick little video fleshing out Hegel. It's good to be back, and I'll see you guys for the next one, which will be about absolute spirit.